The divine life only exists in gift form. Our God is the one who gives and gives and ever gives. Today we have this very famous, very beloved parable of the prodigal son. It's probably the most famous of all Jesus' parables. The story, though, is not really about so much of the prodigal son and how bad he is. See, he's not the one who kind of breaks our hearts and makes us weep. And it's definitely not the jealous and the self-righteous older brother. See, neither of these two sons surprise or shock us at all or amaze us. It's the father. It's the father in this parable that shocks and amazes. See, always when Jesus is telling a parable, there's something in the parable that, if you're really listening, it's like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not how things work. Something that there's a twist that makes you stopping and is puzzling. So we know all those people that are like those two sons. And we probably all see one or both of them in ourselves, if we're honest. As a parable, it's a good mirror for seeing our sinfulness. Yes, absolutely. But that's not surprising. It's challenging enough for us to know who we are. And we're very good at fooling ourselves. It's much harder to know who God is until He reveals Himself in Jesus Christ. It's difficult for us to fully understand and to believe that God is so good, so forgiving, so merciful, that He seems really crazy, far beyond the normal bounds of justice and mercy. That even our worst sins, there is no sin that God will not forgive. That is good news, good beyond all hope. I think that's why this parable is so beloved. Why we love hearing this parable so much. Because we're reminded of that awesome goodness and merciful love of God. It goes far beyond our normal way of doing things. This parable was often one that a good friend of mine, who's now deceased, every time it would come up in the cycle, would come up to me after Mass and say, "Father, I just want you to know that I hate that parable." I go, yes, I know. She goes, "That younger son should have been punished for months. Should have been thrown in jail probably for what he did." There was one of our school teachers, the third grade teacher, was trying to explain this story of the prodigal son to her class, trying to emphasize the resentment of the older brother towards his younger brother. So after she finished telling the story and explaining it, she asked the class, "Now, who was really sad that the prodigal son had come home?" moments, the little boy confidently raised his hand and said, "The fattened calf." You know, this story has such great symbolism. You know, God, as I said at the beginning, is a God who gives. That the divine life only exists in gift form. We don't earn it. God gives it. The thing is that we want these gifts of God. We want our existence, life, success, health, love, respect. We want those things without a true relationship to the giver. In a way, we want those gifts on our terms. We want to make them our possession. Look at the younger son. He says, "Give me the share of the inheritance that is coming to me." Me. That's the attitude of the younger son. See, that doesn't work spiritually. To ask God for His blessings, for His grace, without a real, true, intimate relationship with Him doesn't work. It's not going to happen. These gifts are given by this completely transcendent being, far beyond us. And we wander away from the source when we fail to acknowledge the giver. The gifts dry up. Those gifts are only there in relationship with the one who gives. It's not that He withdraws them. It's that we walk away from them. The younger son goes to this far distant country. You know, he learns his lesson. There's a great famine. What some scholars call, he entered the great emptiness. It's where we end up when we walk away from God. When we try to just use the gifts without the relationship to the giver. See, those gifts given from God when they're divorced from Him disappear. That's one of those basic principles of the spiritual life. We see in the younger son, the story, the parable that Jesus tells us, it says, no one gave him anything. He's no longer in the land of grace. He's in that great emptiness. He's in that land of calculation, tit for tat. It's no longer in the land of gratuitous giving. It's all about me. So the awesome good news is that when everything dries up, when we've been down that path of self-indulgence, when we've been in that land of addiction, whether it's alcohol or sex or power or that selfishness, the good news is that when we turn back, that grace floods in. The Father runs. You know, the Jewish culture, the elderly kind of sit and hold court, especially the elder men, and everyone comes to them. So this father running out to this disrespectful, self-centered, self-indulgent son. When the Jews would have heard this parable, they would have been like, no father is ever going to do that. This Father that Jesus is telling us about is one who gives and gives. And all He wants us to do is receive it. And then He wants us to become givers. That's really the ultimate purpose of what He's all about. He says, not once did I disobey one of your orders. He has not understood this relationship with the Father. He's never caught the Father's effervescent generosity. He's the Puritan, the self-righteous Pharisee. And here's the language of grace that we all need to hear from God. Everything I have is yours. Everything I have is yours, says the Father to the older son. Lately, I've been letting this refrain kind of go through my mind and through my heart during the day. And it's real simple. It's love like Jesus. Today I would say, love like the Father. This ultimate purpose of what Jesus came to do is to enable us, to make it possible for us to love like Him. To love one another, to love God, to love our parish, to love our school, to love each other, to love like Jesus, to love like the Father. St. Paul tells us that, he says, whoever is in Christ. Now, when he says in Christ, that's a phrase that St. Paul uses all the time. He means who lives in Christ and who Christ lives in. Who's ever in an intimate, real relationship with Christ. Who has allowed Christ to share His heart with them. So that Christ lives in us. So whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old has passed away. Then he goes on, this is a beautiful passage from St. Paul. It says, we are ambassadors for Christ. God, as it were, appealing through us. So he says, I implore you, we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, He made Him, Jesus, to be sin who did not know sin, so that we might become the very righteousness of God in Him. It says, God reconciled the world through Christ and entrusted to us, trusted to you and to me, the message of reconciliation. Let us rejoice in this gift that the Father gives us. And let us not be miserly with this gift. Let us be ambassadors of reconciliation.